In the flickering gaslight of 1838 London, a family's fate rests on the shoulders of one young woman. She is a humble maid, armed with little more than quiet dignity and a desperate love for her ailing father. He is the Duke of Northwood, a man whispered about in horrified tones, a monstrously obese recluse, a glutton whose appetites are as vast as his fortune. When a cruel twist of fate forces her into a marriage with this man, she prepares for a life of revulsion and misery. But on their wedding night, behind the locked doors of the ducal chamber, the hulking shadow of her husband reveals a secret so profound, so utterly shocking, it shatters her reality and plunges her into a world of deception and danger she could never have imagined. This is not a fairy tale. This is a story of how the most terrifying monster can hide the most unexpected heart. The chill of a late autumn evening in 1838 crept through the thin floorboards of the Dubois family's modest two-room flat in London, Suffolk. It was a damp, persistent cold that clung to the patched blankets and settled deep in the bones. For 17-year-old Elena Dubois, it was the cold of encroaching dread. Her father, Jean-Luc, a once proud watchmaker, whose hands were now twisted by relentless arthritis, coughed weakly from his cot in the corner. Each rasping breath was a countdown to a fate she dared not contemplate. The debt was a living thing, a predator stalking their small family. A loan taken for a failed medical treatment had metastasized, growing with impossible interest, until it was a sum that might as well have been the king's ransom. The man who held the note, a solicitor named Mr. Finch, had visited that morning. His smile was thin and sharp, like a razor blade. The debt is now property of a new benefactor. He had announced, his eyes lingering on Elena's worn but clean dress. And this benefactor is insistent on settlement. That benefactor was Lord Frederick Beaumont, a man whose name was spoken with a mixture of envy and contempt in the drawing rooms of Mayfair. He was the cousin to a far more formidable figure, Julian Beaumont, the 9th Duke of Northwood. The Duke himself was a creature of horrifying legend. He had not been seen in society for years, having retreated to his sprawling, isolated estate, Hawkswood Manor. Rumour painted him as a grotesque man of gargantuan appetites, who had swelled to a monstrous size, his mind as blighted as his body. They called him the Glutton Duke, a jabber-like figure, wallowing in decadent solitude. The proposal, when it came, was not delivered on scented stationery with a wax seal. It was an ultimatum delivered by Lord Frederick himself. He arrived in a carriage that seemed to suck all the light from their narrow street. Dressed in immaculate finery, he smelled of brandy and disdain. "Miss Dubois," he began, barely glancing at her parents, who huddled together, "I find myself in a position to alleviate your family's considerable distress." He laid out the terms with the detached air of a man discussing livestock. The Duke of Northwood required a wife. His health, was Frederick explained with a smirk, exceedingly fragile. He needed an heir, and quickly. No lady of noble birth would have him not in his reputed state. But a maid, a pretty healthy girl from the gutter, whose family was on the brink of being thrown into a debtor's prison, she would do nicely. "You will marry my cousin, the Duke." Frederick stated, his eyes cold and assessing. "In return, your family's debt will be erased. They will be given a small cottage in the countryside with a pension to see to their needs for the rest of their days. Your father," he added with a pointed look at the coughing man, "will have access to the finest physicians." Elena's mother, Marie, gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. "Marry the Duke of Northwood, but the stories are grotesquely exaggerated, I assure you." Frederick lied smoothly. "He is simply a man of particular habits and great wealth. Your daughter will be a duchess. A small price to pay for such security, wouldn't you agree?" The room fell silent, the only sound the frantic beating of Eleanor's heart. She looked at her father's pale, drawn face, the desperation in her mother's eyes. She thought of her two younger brothers, their futures dissolving into the grime of a workhouse. A duchess. It sounded like a mockery. She would be a nursemaid, a brood mare, shackled to a monster. Her life would be over, but theirs would begin. She lifted her chin, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the oppressive silence. "I accept." Lord Frederick Beaumont smiled a victor's smile. "Excellent. Be ready to leave in 2 days. There is no need for a trousseau. The Duchess of Northwood will want for nothing." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Oh, and Eleanor, do try to look pleased. My cousin is a sensitive man." The moment the carriage door slammed shut, Marie burst into tears, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "Eleanor, my child, what have we done? We cannot let you do this." Eleanor stood rigid in her mother's embrace, her gaze fixed on the damp stain on the far wall. She felt nothing. It was as if her heart had been carved from her chest and replaced with a cold, smooth stone. "You have done nothing, maman," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I have made a choice. We will be safe. That is all that matters." For the next 2 days, she moved like an automaton, packing her few meager belongings into a small valise. She ignored the pitying glances of neighbors and the heartbroken sobs of her mother. She spent her last hours reading to her father, his frail hand gripping hers, his eyes filled with a pain that went far beyond his physical ailments. He knew as she did that this was not a rescue. It was a sacrifice. She, Elena Dubois, was being fed to the beast of Hawkswood Manor to save her family, and as she stepped into the black ducal carriage that arrived to collect her, she left her old life, her hopes, and her very self behind on the grimy cobblestones of Suffolk. The journey north was a journey into hell, and she was its willing bride. The journey to Hawkswood Manor took the better part of a day, the carriage wheels churning through muddy country lanes that seemed to lead further and further from the known world. As they passed through a set of immense wrought-iron gates adorned with the Beaumont crest, a snarling hawk, a palpable gloom descended. The grounds were vast and impeccably manicured, yet possessed a sterile, unloved quality. The trees stood like silent, grim sentinels, and the ancient oaks dripped with moss like old men's beards. And then she saw it. Hawkswood Manor was not a house. It was a fortress of grey stone, a Gothic behemoth that clawed at the bruised twilight sky. Its countless windows stared out like vacant eyes over the rolling empty hills. It was magnificent, terrifying, and utterly devoid of warmth. This was not a home. It was a mausoleum. A severe, hawk-nosed woman in a starched black dress met her at the door. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper," she announced, her voice as crisp and cold as the autumn air. "His Grace is expecting you. The wedding is scheduled for the morrow." There was no welcome, no kindness. Elena was led through cavernous halls where her footsteps echoed on the marble floors. Suits of armor stood guard in the shadows, and the portraits of generations of Beaumonts, their painted eyes seeming to follow her, judged her with aristocratic contempt. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness like rotting fruit. She was shown to a suite of rooms that were larger than her entire London flat. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill. The furniture was heavy and dark, the bed a four-poster monstrosity, draped in velvet curtains so thick they seemed to absorb all sound. It was the most luxurious prison cell imaginable. She did not meet her future husband until the next day, just before the ceremony. Lord Frederick escorted her to the manor's private chapel. It was a small, somber space, lit by a few candles that threw long, dancing shadows. The only other attendees were Mrs. Gable and a nervous-looking local vicar procured for the occasion. And then he entered. The rumours had not done him justice. They had, in fact, been kind. The Duke of Northwood was a mountain of a man, so obese that his form seemed to have lost all definition. He moved with a slow, laborious shuffle, leaning heavily on a thick, gold-topped cane. His face was a bloated, pasty canvas, with small, dark eyes that seemed lost in the fleshy folds. His breathing was a constant wheezing struggle, a wet, rattling sound that filled the sacred silence of the chapel. He was dressed in a black velvet suit that was stretched to its absolute limit, a testament to a tailor's desperate skill. He did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the floor as he positioned himself beside her at the altar. Elena felt a wave of nausea. This was her husband. This was the man who would... She couldn't complete the thought. She focused on the stained glass window behind the altar, on a depiction of a saint being martyred, and found a strange, grim kinship. The vicar stammered through the vows. When it was her turn, Elena's voice was a thread of sound. "I, Elena, take thee, Julian." She forced the words out, each one a betrayal of the girl she had once been. The Duke's response was a low, guttural mumble, the words lost in his laboured breathing. A ring was pushed onto her finger, a diamond so large it felt like a manacle. And then it was over. The vicar pronounced them man and wife. The Duke turned, and without a word or a glance, shuffled out of the chapel, his cane thudding a funereal rhythm on the stone floor. She was the Duchess of Northwood. The wedding dinner was a surreal and horrifying affair. They sat at opposite ends of a banquet table long enough to host a royal delegation. Elena, in a borrowed silk gown that felt like a costume, was served a modest portion of roasted chicken. At the far end of the table, an obscene parade of dishes was brought for the Duke. A whole suckling pig, a platter of glistening oysters, a joint of beef pies, tarts, and a decanter of wine that he emptied with startling speed. He ate with a focused, desperate intensity, his face glistening with sweat and grease. Food was shoveled into his mouth, sometimes falling onto his brocaded waistcoat. He did not speak to her, did not acknowledge her presence in any way. He was an engine of consumption, a man utterly consumed by his own appetites. Elena could barely swallow her own food. She felt a profound, soul-deep revulsion, mixed with a sliver of something she could not name, a tragic pity. No one truly happy could ever eat like that. After the dreadful meal, Mrs. Gable appeared. "His Grace has retired to his chambers. You are to join him." The words struck Elena with the force of a physical blow. The moment she had been dreading the final seal on her bargain was here. Lord Frederick, who had been observing the dinner from a side table, with a cruel, satisfied smirk, now stepped forward. "A word of advice, Your Grace," he purred, using her new title for the first time. "My cousin is a man of simple needs. Be accommodating. Your family's future depends on it." His threat hung in the air as Mrs. Gable led her up the grand staircase, down a long, dark corridor towards the Duke's private wing. The housekeeper's face was an unreadable mask of professional indifference. She stopped before a pair of towering oak doors. "His Grace is waiting," she said. And then, with the barest flicker of something in her eyes, was it pity, contempt? Elena couldn't tell. She turned and walked away, her footsteps receding into the oppressive silence. Elena stood before the doors for a full minute, her body trembling. This was it. The end of the line. She was property now purchased to satisfy the urges of the creature within. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she closed her eyes, pictured her father breathing easier in a warm country cottage and pushed the heavy doors open. The Duke's bedchamber was a cavern of shadows and excess. A massive fireplace roared at one end, casting a flickering, hellish light on the opulent chaos. The room was cluttered with expensive furniture, astronomical charts, half-finished models of sailing ships, and stacks upon stacks of books. It smelled of old leather wood smoke and the faint, sickly sweet scent she had noticed before. And there he was, her husband. He stood with his back to her, facing the great mullioned window that looked out onto the black, wind-swept moors. His colossal silhouette blotted out the moonlight, a hulking shape of pure menace. The sound of his wheezing breath was louder here, a constant labored counterpoint to the crackling fire and the howling wind outside. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs so violently she felt it might break free. She quietly closed the doors behind her, the click of the latch echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. She stood rooted to the spot, waiting for him to turn, for him to speak, for the inevitable horrifying consummation of this grotesque parody of a marriage. He did not turn. He remained at the window, his shoulders rising and falling with each difficult breath. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Elena's fear began to curdle into a strange, defiant anger. If he was going to claim his prize, let him do it. This waiting, this silence, was a torture all its own. "Your Grace." She finally managed to say, her voice small and tight. The great shape at the window flinched, as if surprised by the sound. He still did not turn. "The servants are gone," he said. His voice was not the guttural mumble from the chapel. It was a deep, resonant baritone, but it was strained, muffled, as if he was speaking through a thick cloth. "There is no one to hear us. You may speak freely." Elena was taken aback. "Speak freely about what, Your Grace?" "About this situation," he wheezed. "Tell me, what do you think of your husband?" The question was so bizarre, so unexpected, that it momentarily broke through her fear. Was this a test? A cruel game? She chose her words carefully. "You are the Duke of Northwood. I am your wife. My thoughts are of no consequence." A sound came from him, then a low rumble that might have been a chuckle, but it turned into a hacking cough. He gripped the window frame for support. "Ah, yes. The dutiful wife. Frederick chose well. Docile, obedient, unlikely to make a fuss." He paused, his breathing ragged. "But what do you see, Elena Dubois? When you look at me, what do you truly see?" Her patience snapped. The terror, the humiliation, the sacrifice, it all boiled over. "I see a man who hides behind his title and his dinner plate," she retorted, her voice shaking with a passion she didn't know she possessed. "I see the cage my family has been freed from, and the one I have just entered. You want honesty, Your Grace. I see a monster who buys his brides, because no woman would have him otherwise." The words, once spoken, hung in the air, sharp and glittering with venom. She instantly regretted them, a cold dread washing over her. She had just insulted the most powerful man she had ever met, a man on whom her family's very survival depended. She had sealed her own doom. The room was utterly silent, save for the fire and the wind. The Duke's massive shoulders stopped their pained rising and falling. He stood perfectly still. Then he did something extraordinary. He reached up to his neck. There was a sound of a latch unfastening. He tugged at the sides of his face. With a soft sighing sound, a prosthetic mask of bloated cheeks and jowls came away in his hands. He tossed it onto a nearby chair. He began to unbutton his waistcoat, then his shirt. He shrugged his enormous shoulders, and a vast, padded contraption, a masterpiece of quilted fabric and stuffing, designed to create the illusion of grotesque obesity, slid from his torso and fell to the floor with a muffled thump. The man who turned to face her was not the man from the chapel. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, powerful build of a horseman or a fencer. The face that looked at her was angular and intelligent, with a strong jaw, a straight nose, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. They were the same eyes she realized, but no longer lost in folds of flesh. They were sharp, piercing, and filled with a weary, profound sadness. He was by any measure a strikingly handsome man. He looked to be no older than 30. Elena was rendered utterly speechless. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her mind simply refused to process what her eyes were seeing. She took a half step back, her hand flying to her throat. "Now," he said, his voice clear and deep, no longer strained or muffled. "Ask me again what you see." Elena could only shake her head, her mind reeling. "Who? What are you?" "I am Julian Beaumont, Duke of Northwood," he said, his voice laced with a bitter irony. "Your husband, the monster of Hawkswood Manor." He gestured to the discarded padding on the floor. "This rat," he said, kicking it with the toe of a polished leather boot, "is a lie. A very carefully constructed, suffocatingly hot and utterly necessary lie." "But why?" She whispered the single word, encompassing 1,000 questions. Why the charade? Why the public disgrace? Why marry her? Julian's handsome face hardened. "Because the world is full of vultures, Elena. My father died 2 years ago, leaving me a title, a vast fortune, and a target on my back. The debutantes of London saw a walking vault of coin, not a man. Their mothers saw a dynasty to be captured. And my dear cousin, Lord Frederick, he spat the name like poison, saw an obstacle. He began to pace before the fire, his movements fluid and energetic, a stark contrast to the lumbering creature he had pretended to be. Frederick wants my title. He has been systematically trying to ruin me. He spreads the rumors of my gluttony, my ill health, my madness. He hopes to have me declared incompetent, or better yet, to see me drink and eat myself into an early grave." He stopped and looked directly at her, his stormy eyes locking onto hers. "So I decided to give them the monster they wanted. I became the recluse. I let the rumors fester. It has kept the fortune hunters at bay, and it has made my cousin complacent. He thinks I am a fool, slowly pickling himself in wine and pâté. He doesn't realize I am watching his every move." Elena's mind was racing, trying to piece it all together. "My family's debt was purchased by Frederick, yes," Julian confirmed. "He drove your father's business into the ground through proxies, then bought the debt for pennies. He didn't do it to help you. He did it to buy a wife for me. A simple, powerless girl from the slums who would be too terrified to question anything. A girl who he likely assumes will produce the required heir and then can be quietly disposed of." The casual, chilling way he said it sent a fresh wave of fear through her. This was no longer just about a miserable marriage. This was a game of shadows and daggers, and she had just been moved onto the board as a pawn. "He chose you," Julian continued, his voice softening slightly, as he saw the genuine terror on her face. "And I allowed it. I investigated you, Elena. I know you are the daughter of an honest man. I know you have worked since you were 12 to support your family. I know you accepted this monstrous bargain, not for yourself, but for them. I was looking for someone with courage, with loyalty, someone who was not part of the viper's nest of the aristocracy. I was looking for an ally." He stood before her now, no longer a monster, but a man caught in a dangerous trap of his own making. Frederick thinks he has given me a puppet. I am betting he has in fact given me a queen." Elena stared at him, at this impossible stranger who was her husband. The revulsion she had felt was gone, replaced by a dizzying swirl of confusion, fear, and a tiny, unbelievable spark of hope. Her life was not over. It had just begun, and it was to be a far more complex and perilous story than she could ever have imagined. "The charade," she finally whispered, understanding dawning. "We must continue it." A slow, weary smile touched Julian Beaumont's lips for the first time. "For now, yes. To the world, and especially to my cousin, I am the glutton duke, and you, your grace," he said with a slight ironic bow, "are my terrified captive bride. I trust you are a convincing actress." The next morning, Elena woke in the vast, cold bed, the velvet curtains shutting out the grey dawn. For a fleeting moment, she thought the previous night had been a fever dream, the grotesque groom, the horrifying dinner, the impossible revelation. But then she saw it tossed in a heap near the fireplace, the discarded padding and prosthetic mask of the glutton duke. It was real. A soft knock came at the door, and Mrs. Gable entered with a tea tray. The housekeeper's face was as impassive as ever, but her eyes darted to the discarded costume, then to Elena, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "His Grace has already taken his breakfast in his study," the housekeeper said, her tone clipped. "He has requested a tray of pastries and a bottle of claret." The way she said it was rote, a line learned from a play. Elena understood immediately. The performance had begun. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable." As the housekeeper turned to leave, Elena summoned her courage. "Mrs. Gable, you know." It wasn't a question. The woman paused, her hand on the door latch. She turned back, and for the first time the mask of stern indifference cracked, revealing a face etched with weary loyalty. "I have served the Beaumont family since his Grace was a boy in short trousers. I knew his father a good man. And I know Lord Frederick for the serpent he is." Her gaze on Elena was sharp, appraising. "His Grace has placed a great deal of trust in you, your Grace. I pray it is not misplaced." With a curt nod, she was gone. Elena realized then that she was not entirely alone. There was at least one other person in this fortress who knew the truth. Later that day, Julian summoned her to the library. When she entered, she found him not in his monstrous disguise, but as himself. He was dressed in simple riding breeches and a linen shirt, and he was poring over a large map of the estate. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment an awkward silence fell between them. They were husband and wife co-conspirators, yet they were complete strangers. "We need to set the terms of our arrangement," he said, gesturing to a chair opposite the great oak desk. "Firstly, your family is safe. I have already dispatched my own man of business, a Mr. Abernathy from London, to oversee their move to a cottage in Devonshire, far from Frederick's reach. The pension is real, and it comes from my personal accounts, not his. Whatever happens here, they will not be touched." A wave of relief so profound it made her dizzy washed over Elena. "Thank you," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate. "It is the least I can do," he said gruffly, turning back to his maps. "Secondly, our public life. In the presence of any servant, save Mrs. Gable, or any guest, I am the creature you married. You are the timid, unhappy bride. It is a distasteful role, I know, but it is essential. Frederick must continue to believe he is in control. And in private?" she asked, her voice quiet. He finally met her gaze, his stormy eyes serious. "In private, we are allies. You are not my prisoner, Eleanor. You are perhaps my only hope." Frederick is not just stealing from the estate. I have found discrepancies in the ledgers going back months. I believe he is plotting something far worse. He has powerful friends in Parliament, men who would be happy to see the Northwood fortune carved up. I need proof. Something solid enough to see him tried for treason against the dukedom, not just embezzlement. He pointed to a stack of account books on the desk. He is clever. The trail is well hidden. But you have an advantage I do not. You were a maid. You understand the world below stairs. People will talk in front of you, dismiss you. Servants see and hear everything. He will have spies in this house, people on his payroll. I need you to be my eyes and my ears. He was asking her to be a spy in her own home, to navigate a web of intrigue she could barely comprehend. It was terrifying, but it was also the first time in her life anyone had looked at her and seen not a servant, not a pawn, not a woman to be bought, but an intelligent and capable partner. I will do what I can, she said, her resolve hardening. Their strange alliance was tested only a few days later. Lord Frederick arrived unannounced, his carriage thundering up the drive. Julian, forewarned by a stable boy, had barely enough time to don his suffocating costume. Elena was arranging flowers in the grand hall when Frederick entered, bringing a blast of cold air with him. "Your Grace," he said, his lips twisting in a mocking smile. "I trust you are finding married life to your liking." "My lord," Elena replied, curtsying as a duchess should. She kept her eyes downcast, her hands trembling slightly, a tremor that was only half pretense. At that moment, the Duke made his entrance from the top of the stairs. He was in full character, leaning heavily on his cane, his breathing a theatrical wheeze. "Frederick!" He grunted, his voice muffled and thick. "What do you want?" "Just paying my respects to the happy couple, cousin." Frederick said, his eyes gleaming with malice as he watched Julian's slow, painful descent. "I see you're looking well fed, as usual. I trust your new bride is taking good care of you." "She does as she's told," Julian grunted deliberately, avoiding eye contact with Elena. He slumped into a large, reinforced chair, the wood groaning in protest. "Now state your business. You interrupt my lunch." Frederick's smile widened. He turned his cruel attention back to Eleanor. "I have just come from London. I had the pleasure of seeing your family's old tenement. Such a grim little place. It is a relief to know they are now settled comfortably, all thanks to my generosity." The threat was clear, a silken reminder of the power he held over her. Elena felt a surge of cold fury. This man was taking credit for Julian's decency while holding it over her head as a weapon. She remembered Julian's words, "Be my eyes and ears." She looked at Frederick, letting a flicker of fear show in her eyes. "We are very grateful, my lord." "Of course you are," he said patronizingly. "See that you remain so." He then turned to business with Julian, discussing shipments, tenant leases, and the sale of a parcel of land. Elena stood silently to the side, playing the part of the invisible wife. But she wasn't just standing there. She was listening. She noted the name of the shipping company, Cavendish Trading, and the way Frederick glossed over the profits from a timber sale, citing unexpected tariffs. To the wheezing, distracted Duke, it would mean nothing. To Julian, she suspected it might be a thread to pull. After Frederick left, Julian tore off the hated costume, his face slick with sweat and flushed with anger. The man's arrogance is breathtaking. "He mentioned Cavendish Trading," Elena said immediately, "and the timber tariffs. He looked at you when he said it, as if testing to see if you were paying attention." Julian stopped looking at her with a newfound respect. "Did he now?" He strode over to his desk and made a note. "Good. That's very good, Elena. That evening they ate dinner together in the small private study, away from prying eyes. For the first time, they spoke not as Duke and Duchess, or as schemer and pawn, but as two people. She told him about her father's delicate work with watch gears, and he told her about his passion for astronomy, pointing out constellations through the library's telescope. He was intelligent, witty, and possessed a deep-seated integrity that she found herself admiring. She saw the weight he carried, the responsibility for his lands, his tenants, and the legacy of his name, all while fighting a silent war against his own blood. And he in turn saw past the humble maid and saw a woman of sharp intellect and quiet strength. As she retired to her own chamber that night, a separate room, a boundary he had insisted upon to honor the false nature of their marriage, Elena realized her feelings were becoming dangerously complicated. She had married a monster, only to discover a man. Now locked in this uneasy alliance, she was beginning to fear that she might be losing her heart to him, a heart she had thought was frozen solid. And in their dangerous world, love was a complication neither of them could afford. The days at Hawkswood Manor settled into a strange and secret rhythm. Publicly, Elena was the Duchess of Northwood, a pale, silent figure trailing in the wake of her grotesque husband. She endured the feigned sympathy and veiled contempt of the few local gentry who dared to call playing her part with a convincing meekness that seemed to delight Lord Frederick on his frequent visits. The staff, taking their cue from the Duke's apparent indifference, largely ignored her, seeing her as a temporary fixture, a necessary vessel for an heir. But this public persona was Eleanor's greatest weapon. She was invisible, and the invisible see and hear everything. She began her espionage in the kitchens. As a former servant, she knew this was the heart of any great house, the central hub of gossip and information. She would go down under the pretense of discussing menus with the cook, a bluff that worked, because the Duke's prodigious appetite was legendary. While the cook-a-man secretly in Frederick's pay would list the rich foods planned for the Duke's table, Elena would listen. She listened to the footman talking about the late-night visitor who met with Lord Frederick's valet. She heard a laundry maid complain about the strange clay stains on the valet's boots, even though he never left the manor. Clay from the riverbank, perhaps, where the Cavendish trading barges docked. She reported everything to Julian during their clandestine meetings in the library late at night. The room had become their sanctuary, the one place where the masks came off. He would listen intently, piecing together the fragments she brought him, his handsome face a mask of concentration. "The valet's name is Dawson," he murmured one evening, marking a map. "If he is meeting someone from the Cavendish barges at night, it means Frederick isn't just skimming profits. He's smuggling, using my barges, my good name, to move untaxed goods. The timber tariffs he mentioned were a lie to cover the missing revenue." Their intellectual partnership began to bleed into something more personal. He taught her about ledgers and accounts, impressed by how quickly she grasped the complex columns of figures. She in turn would speak of her life in London, painting a picture of a world he had only ever viewed from a carriage window. They discovered a shared love for Shakespeare, and would read scenes aloud to each other by the fire, their voices intertwining in the quiet room. One night, as a storm raged outside, rattling the window panes, Elena found him staring into the fire, a look of profound melancholy on his face. "What is it?" she asked softly. He was silent for a long moment. "I was engaged once," he said, his voice low, "before my father died, to Lady Beatrice Croft. She was the toast of the season, beautiful, charming, witty." A bitter smile touched his lips. "I thought she loved me. But when my father passed, and the full weight of the dukedom fell on me, the reality of it, the endless work, the responsibility. It bored her. The night I told her I intended to spend most of the year here at Hawkswood, managing the estate myself rather than leaving it to agents. She laughed in my face. She told me she had agreed to marry a duke, not a glorified farmer. She broke our engagement 2 days later and was betrothed to a foppish earl with a London townhouse by the end of the month. He finally looked at Elena, his eyes raw with the memory of the betrayal. That's when I understood. It was never about me, the man. It was about the title, the glamour, the London seasons. It was all a performance. So I decided, if they wanted a performance, I would give them one they would never forget. I would become a creature so repellent that only someone of true character or someone with no other choice would ever come near me. He looked at her pointedly. And then Frederick delivered you to my door. In his confession, Elena saw the deep wound that had prompted his bizarre, lonely charade. He was a man who felt so profoundly betrayed by the artifice of his world that he had chosen to encase himself in a lie to protect his heart. Her own heart ached for him. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his on the arm of the chair. It was the first time they had touched as themselves. His hand was warm and strong. He turned his palm up his fingers, gently closing around hers. A current warm and startling passed between them. They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling, their hands clasped together, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that was growing between them. The next day, Eleanor made her boldest move yet. She knew Lord Frederick kept a small private study on the ground floor for when he visited. It was kept locked, but she had seen Dawson, the valet, enter with a key. She had to get inside. Pleading a headache, she retired to her room in the afternoon. But instead of resting, she crept through the servants' corridors, her heart pounding. She had, accidentally, spilled a small bottle of ink on Dawson's livery coat that morning, while he was assisting his master. She knew that at this hour he would be in the laundry room trying to remove the stain. It was a small window of opportunity. Using a hairpin from her hair, a trick learned from her younger brothers, who were always picking locks, she worked at the study door. Her hands trembled, and for a moment she thought it was hopeless. But then, with a soft click, the lock gave way. She slipped inside. The room was meticulously tidy. A large desk dominated the space. She began to search her movements, quick and desperate. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a false bottom, she discovered only by chance, she found it a second ledger. She opened it. Her blood ran cold. This was not a book of estate accounts. It was a record of bribes of payments to officials of smuggled goods. She saw the name Cavendish Trading again and again. But there was more. There were names of prominent lords and members of Parliament, and there were notes written in Frederick's own hand outlining a plan. A plan to use manufactured evidence of Julian's madness testimonies from paid-off servants, a forged doctor's report, to petition Parliament to have him stripped of his title and confined to an asylum. Frederick would then be named regent of the estate. He wasn't just planning to rob Julian. He was planning to bury him alive. She heard footsteps in the hall. Dawson was returning. Panicked, she grabbed the ledger, tucked it into the folds of her dress, and slipped out of the room, pulling the door shut, just as the valet rounded the corner. He gave her a suspicious look. "Your Grace, are you lost?" "Oh." Elena feigned surprise, pressing a hand to her head. "My headache. I must have taken a wrong turn. Forgive me." She fled back to her rooms, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. She had the proof. But now she and Julian were in more danger than ever before. Holding the damning evidence in her hands, she knew their secret war was about to escalate into a final deadly confrontation. The ledger felt like a block of ice against Elena's skin. She burst into the library where Julian was working, her face pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't speak, merely laid the hidden book on his desk. He took one look at her face, then opened the ledger. As he read, his expression went from grim concentration to cold, controlled fury. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin stretched taut over the sharp bones of his cheeks and jaw. He read the details of his cousin's meticulous betrayal, the plan to have him declared insane and stripped of everything he was. "An asylum," he said, the words barely a whisper, yet filled with a chilling quiet. He would have me locked away to rot. He closed the book with a soft, final thud. He looked up at Elena, his stormy eyes blazing. "He has underestimated us for the last time." "What do we do?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Do we send for the authorities? Take this to London?" "No," Julian said, rising from his chair and beginning to pace. "Frederick is too well connected. His allies in Parliament would bury this claim it was a forgery. They would turn it against us, use it as proof of my paranoia. We cannot simply present the evidence. We have to catch him in the act of trying to retrieve it. We need to make his guilt undeniable with witnesses." His eyes narrowed, a plan already forming. "We will set a trap, and we will use his own arrogance as the bait." The annual harvest ball at Hawkswood Manor was a tradition Julian had allowed to lapse since beginning his charade. He now announced, to the shock of the staff and local gentry, that it would be reinstated. Invitations were sent. Lord Frederick, upon hearing the news, was openly delighted, seeing it as a perfect opportunity to display his mad cousin to a wider audience, further cementing the public perception of his incompetence. The days leading up to the ball were a blur of activity and tension. To the outside world, the manor was being prepared for a grand celebration. Silks were unfurled, silver was polished, and musicians were hired. But for Elena and Julian, it was the careful staging of a battlefield. Their plan was simple, yet perilous. Elena would let slip to a lady's maid she knew to be in Frederick's pay that she had discovered something incriminating. She would claim she didn't understand its importance, but that the shocking ledger was safely locked in the Duke's private safe, and that Mr. Abernathy, the Duke's solicitor, was arriving the morning after the ball to collect it. "This will force Frederick's hand," Julian explained during one of their final late-night strategy sessions. "He cannot risk Abernathy seeing that book. He will have to try and steal it himself during the chaos of the ball." "And when he does?" Elena asked, her nerves frayed. "The study will be prepared," Julian said grimly, "and we will be waiting." The night of the ball arrived, a crisp, clear evening, with a sliver of a moon. Hawkswood Manor blazed with light, a glittering jewel in the dark countryside. Carriages arrived one after another, disgorging a river of silks, satins, and jewels into the grand hall. Elena stood beside her husband at the top of the grand staircase, receiving their guests. Julian was in his full monstrous costume, looking more grotesque than ever amidst the splendor. He wheezed and grunted, leaning heavily on his cane, playing the part of the reluctant boorish host to perfection. Elena, gowned in a simple but elegant dress of deep blue silk, maintained her role as the timid, cowed bride. She watched Lord Frederick arrive, preening and confident, accepting greetings as if he were already the master of the house. Halfway through the evening, Elena sought out the gossiping lady's maid, a girl named Clara. With feigned naivete, she whispered about the dreadfully confusing account book she'd found in Lord Frederick's old study. "So many names," Elena said, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence. And notes about Parliament? I showed it to His Grace, and he became so agitated. He locked it in his safe and said his solicitor must see it immediately. Mr. Abernathy is coming from London on the morning coach. She watched as Clara's eyes widened with self-importance. The bait was taken. Eleanor excused herself and watched from across the ballroom as Clara scurried over to whisper urgently in Lord Frederick's ear. She saw the flicker of alarm on his face, quickly masked by a charming smile. The trap was set. An hour later, as the orchestra swelled for a waltz, Elena saw Frederick slip away from the ballroom. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was happening. She caught Julian's eye across the crowded room. He gave a barely perceptible nod, then began a loud, wheezing, coughing fit, creating a diversion that drew the attention of those around him. Elena melted away into the shadows of the corridor, her silk slippers making no sound on the thick carpets. She did not follow Frederick directly. Instead, she went to the library where Julian had told her to wait. The room was dark and silent, a stark contrast to the brilliant celebration happening just one floor below. The wait was agonizing. Every creak of the old house, every distant burst of laughter from the ball made her jump. She trusted Julian. She trusted his plan. But Frederick was a cornered rat, and cornered rats were dangerous. Suddenly, she heard a noise from the direction of the Duke's study down the hall, a muffled crash, followed by a shouted oath. Then another voice, sharp and commanding, Julian's true voice. "It's over, Frederick." Elena held her breath, her hand pressed to her mouth. The trap had been sprung. The war for Hawkswood Manor, and for Julian's life, was reaching its conclusion in the silent, shadowed wing of the house, while downstairs the music played on. Drawn by the sounds of conflict, Elena crept to the open door of the Duke's study and peered inside. The scene was a frozen tableau of confrontation. Lord Frederick stood beside the desk, a crowbar in his hand, the reinforced door of the ducal safe hanging from its hinges. His elegant ballroom attire was askew, his face a mask of shocked fury. Facing him was Julian. He had shed his cumbersome costume and stood tall and powerful in simple clothes. This was the true Duke of Northwood, his eyes blazing with cold fire. Beside him, solid and uncompromising, were two men from the local constabulary. The treacherous valet Dawson was already in restraints near the fireplace. "Were you looking for this?" Julian asked, his voice ringing with authority. He held up the ledger, the real one. Frederick's eyes darted from the incriminating book to the guards, his mind racing for an escape. "Julian, cousin, this is a terrible misunderstanding." He stammered, his customary charm turning brittle with desperation. "I discovered this forgery and was merely securing it to protect you from your delusions." A short, harsh laugh escaped Julian. "My delusions. Tell me, Frederick, was it a delusion that you systematically defrauded my estate and used my name to smuggle goods? Or was it a delusion—" his voice dropped to a dangerous growl— "that you conspired to have me falsely committed to an asylum so you could seize my title?" He threw the ledger onto the desk, where it fell open to a page of damning evidence in Frederick's own hand. "It's over." The last of Frederick's composure shattered. "You were supposed to be a pathetic fool." He snarled, his face contorted with hate. "A pig in a waistcoat, drinking himself into an early grave." In a final desperate act, he lunged for the ledger, intending to hurl it into the fire. But Julian moved with a startling speed, intercepting his cousin with a powerful shove that sent him stumbling back into the arms of the waiting guards. The struggle was brief and decisive. The war was over. "Take him away," Julian commanded, his voice heavy with a weary finality. As the guards dragged the cursing, struggling Frederick from the room, Julian's powerful shoulders slumped. The tension drained from him, leaving behind not a triumphant victor, but a man wounded by the deep betrayal of his own blood. Elena stepped quietly into the room. He looked up his stormy eyes, finding hers across the space. "It's done," he said. "It is," she affirmed, moving toward the desk that stood between them like a barrier. The charade that had brought them together was finished. The Glutton Duke was gone. The question of what remained hung in the heavy silence. Julian broke it first, his voice formal. "Elena, the terms of our arrangement have been fulfilled. You are free. I will arrange for a quiet annulment, and you will be provided for handsomely. You have earned your freedom. You may return to your family." He was offering her an escape, the life she would have once craved. But as she looked at him, the intelligent, honorable, and lonely man who had seen her worth, when no one else had, she knew that leaving Hawkswood Manor would be the real imprisonment. "My family is safe and cared for," she said softly, her gaze steady on his. "My life is no longer with them." A flicker of hope of disbelief entered his eyes. Elena took a steadying breath and made a choice. She walked around the great oak desk, closing the physical and emotional distance between them. "I was forced to marry the Duke of Northwood," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But I have come to know the man, a man of courage and integrity. I believe I could be a true partner to that man, if he would have me." Julian stared at her, his expression one of stunned wonder. "You would choose to stay after all the lies and the danger." "The lies are over," she said, reaching up to gently touch his cheek. "I am not choosing to stay in a gilded cage. I am choosing to stay with my husband." A slow, brilliant smile spread across Julian's face, a smile of pure joy that transformed his weary features. He covered her hand with his own, his thumb stroking her skin. "Then I, Julian Beaumont," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "choose to stay with my wife, my Duchess." He leaned down and kissed her. It was a kiss not of duty or desperation, but of profound tenderness and promise, a love forged in secrecy and finally free. The shadows had lifted from Hawkswood Manor, making way for a new and brilliant dawn. And so, the tale of the Glutton Duke and the humble maid comes to a close. But it's more than just a story of a secret revealed on a wedding night. It's a testament to the fact that courage can be found in the quietest hearts, and that true sight has nothing to do with what our eyes behold, but everything to do with what our souls can perceive. Elena and Julian's journey reminds us that the prisons we build, whether from lies, fear, or public opinion, can be unlocked by trust, and that love can blossom in the most barren of grounds. They didn't just find an ally in each other. They found a home in a world that had offered them none. If their story of intrigue, courage, and unexpected love resonated with you, please help us share it with others. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share this video with a friend who appreciates a tale where things are never quite what they seem. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the dramatic pages of history. Thank you for listening.